My name is unimportant, but what I do is. I'm a member of an elite unit you'll never hear of. We contain incidences of all kinds. Not only do we deal with physical issues, but we also keep the information from the public. It's better that way. It keeps people from panicking and helps maintain order. I found a notebook on my last mission. Even though it violates the rules, I owe it to the author to tell his story. I know it'll be written off as a conspiracy theory or some crackpot Reddit post, so there's no real danger. At least, I don't think there is. It reads as follows. Here I sit in this moldy, godforsaken cell, awaiting my unfair death sentence to be carried out. I can't stand my neighbors. They're noisy and they stink. It's my own fault, though. If I hadn't been responsible and tried to help, I wouldn't be here right now. Ironically, doing the right thing has doomed me. It all started a long time ago, in a golden age that I like to call last week. Good morning, Miss Watner. You're looking as lovely as ever. For someone who looks so old that even a mummy would turn tail and run. Why, Jonathan, aren't you sweet? Thank you, ma'am. Will that be paper or plastic? Paper, of course. We can always grow more trees, can't we? Yes, ma'am. Maybe one day soon we'll use one to make you a nice coffin. The old crone drifted away, flashing her huge diamond ring and mink coat. I never understood why she bothered to come to the grocery store, when she could always have her servants do it for her. Then it hit me. This was her way of staying in touch with the commoners, of proving to herself that she was still human. I can't blame her too much, I guess. If I was obscenely rich, I'd want to flaunt it too. Uh-oh. Looks like Mr. Burgess is heading towards Jane's register. I'd better go help. Jane, you have an urgent phone call in the office. I'll cover for you. A wave of relief washes over her, as panic had started to flood her face. Thank you, she whispered, touching my shoulder and sending warmth through me. Humph, Mr. Burgess mumbled, leering at her as she went. Take away the only good part of my day. Good morning, Mr. Burgess. Are you having a party? I asked, as a dozen cans of Sterno rolled down the belt, followed by 10 boxes of matches and 5 cases of bottled water. Never mind what I'm doing, he growled. Oof. I struggled to stay upright from the stench of alcohol that wafted from his mouth. Yes, sir. That'll be $157.32, please. He grumbled something that I couldn't make out as his gnarled fingers reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 brand new $100 bills. I handed him back his change. You have a nice day now. He shot me a look of scorn mixed with pity, a look I would have expected to see a hunter give to wounded prey. Humph, was all he said as he scuttled out through the door. As I watched him go with the same look of scorn and pity, a man stumbled in. He wasn't remarkable in any way, but something told me to keep an eye on him. He was of average height and size, but he shuffled instead of walked. The look in his eyes was vacant, as if the lights were on, but no one was home. He shuffled past me just as Jane returned to her register. She shot me a look of gratitude with just a hint of affection, but I was too focused to acknowledge it. As if mesmerized, I drifted behind him, trying to remain inconspicuous as he slowly made his way to the pharmacy section. I turned the corner and there he stood, swaying back and forth as though driven by a non-existent breeze. I approached him. Can I help you, sir? As he turned towards me, I could see scratches on his neck and a hint of dried blood under his jacket. He stared at me with those empty eyes. Instinctually, my hand slipped behind my back and grasped the handle of my knife, something I carried for just such an occasion. I set my feet and prepared for him to lunge at me. This is it, I thought. 12 years of working at this menial job have finally paid off. I'm in the right place at the right time to stop the outbreak. I just need to be sure, or I'll spend the next 20 somewhere much worse. I pulled the knife out just an inch when he cleared his throat. Sorry, it's my wife. She isn't feeling well. I slid the knife back into my sheath and said, I'm sorry to hear that. Is there anything I can help you find? His vacant eyes drifted back to the shelf. He picked up a bottle of Midol and a pack of tampons. These should do it. He tried to force a smile and shuffled past me towards the checkout. Something was still nagging at me about him. I went back to my register and bagged groceries while he waited in line. When he shuffled towards the front door, I mumbled something about needing carts and followed him outside. He had parked his car at the edge of the lot, but even partway there, I could see the car he was heading for was rocking back and forth and sounded like someone was pounding from inside. As I approached, I saw blood smeared all over the window and the face of a large woman pressed against the glass. I was 30 feet away when he reached the car and unlocked the door. "Don't!" I screamed, reaching for the knife, but he'd already pulled the door handle. She exploded out of the car and launched herself at him. He fell backwards, and she began devouring him like a starving lion on its prey. She clawed at him and ripped out his throat with her teeth, making a geyser of blood. He tried to cry out, but all that came out was a bloody gurgle. I shook off the shock of the pure, stark reality of the situation and took advantage of my opening. I held my knife over my head, closed my eyes, and swung as hard as I could. I missed the first try and only managed to slice off her ear. Needless to say, that got her attention. She ceased gouging at him and turned towards me. Crap! I tried to ready myself in a defensive stance, but she lunged at me, growling. I held the knife in front of me and she impaled herself on it. Unfortunately, it sunk into her neck. The force of her impact knocked me onto my back. I nearly lost consciousness when my head bounced off the pavement. My vision swam as she snapped her bloody teeth at me. I held her at bay with the knife that was still lodged in her throat, the same knife I would need to kill her. After a quick moment's thought and a frantic plan, I shoved my forearm into her chest and yanked the knife free. I lost ground in the process and felt her teeth scrape my nose as I swung the knife around and buried it in her ear. It looked like a movie in pause. She stopped with her mouth frozen open, then slowly rolled off of me. I sat up as best I could, stared down at her, pulling my knife out, and then I shoved it in his ear, just to be sure. "Freeze!" came a loud voice from behind me. I turned to see 3 police cars with their lights flashing. 6 officers, all pointing their guns at me. "Drop the knife, get on your knees, lace your fingers behind your head," the officer said. "Are you kidding me? I just saved everyone," I said incredulously. "Do it now or we will shoot you." The knife clattered to the ground as I did as I was told. In a heartbeat, I was cuffed and stuffed, riding towards the station in the back of the police car. "Third-degree murder? Are you nuts?" I yelled at the attorney, seated across the table from me. "That's the best I can do. You brutally murdered 2 people in broad daylight in front of a dozen witnesses." "They weren't people anymore." "Let me guess, you thought they were—" "Yes, I did, and they were." He threw his papers into his briefcase and started towards the door. "I'll register an insanity plea if you want me to." "I'm not insane. You have to listen to me. We can stop it. Find out who those people were and where they were coming from. The police in that town need to be alerted." He rolled his eyes. "I already know who they were and where they were from. Michael and Sarah Weston. They lived right here in Frost Creek. They both worked at the hospital. She was a nurse and he worked in maintenance." I slumped in my chair. It's over. There's no way I can stop it if it started in town. The guards took me back to my cell, where I sat in quiet desperation, trying to decide what to do next. I took the tablet and the pencil I'd been given when I was booked and started writing this as a bit of a history. Right now, it's just so I can keep the events straight in my own head. I'm calling it Dear John, a letter to the undead. By the time I'm done writing this, there won't be anyone left alive to read it. It only started yesterday, back when my life was uncomplicated and boring. When I was done writing, my wrist hurt. Logging down the demise of humanity will do that. I tried to warn the officers when they would pass my cell at mealtime. It became a litany. Is there anything strange going on in town? Do you have enough food, water, and ammo at home? Is your family someplace where you can protect them? My concern was met with scorn and even alarm. I guess they felt threatened by my questions. I don't know why. After a while, the officers came through less and less. That was when it happened. My cell window looked out towards a truck stop. I was lying on my bunk when I felt as much as heard the explosion. I jumped up and stared in shock as the tanker truck was up in flames, sending black smoke pouring into the air. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and still no fire trucks had arrived. With little wind, the smoke had settled at street level, making visibility near zero. An hour later, the wind picked up and blew away the haze just enough to see the sun riding low on the horizon. That's when I saw them. They were shambling through the haze, unfocused with no direction. They just came. I watched with a helpless detachment, knowing that there was nothing I could do about it. I heard the first gunshot a few minutes later. They shambled into the cell block, 2 and 3 at a time. It didn't take long for the smell of rotting flesh to surround my cell, reaching through the bars like groupies at a rock concert. Thank God there was a wall behind me. I watched in hopeless fascination as the inmates in the cell next to me got too close to the bars and were torn apart. So here I sit, the putrid scent of death and decay overwhelming me, but no more than the knowledge that I could have stopped this, or at least warned people if I hadn't been arrested. The least I can do is write this letter to whoever might be left alive to read it. So maybe they know how this whole thing began, and it might help them in some small way. Day 2. I can honestly say that this is the first time I've ever entertained the thought of drinking out of the toilet. Thirst is driving me mad, though, and the sink is unfortunately located next to the bars. My guests have not gotten bored and moved on like I thought they would. If anything, they seem to have doubled in numbers. On the plus side, all the growling and jostling kept me awake so that I wouldn't have to worry about being grabbed in my sleep. No, I can be sure I'll be awake and alert so that I feel every set of teeth as I'm slowly devoured. It's always good to think positively. One of the deputies has made his way to the front of the cell. The keys to the cell dangle tantalizingly from his belt. I'm hypnotized by them. I could go insane just thinking about the possibilities. But the fact of the matter is, I know I'd be dead before I shoved the key in the lock. It does make me smile, though, knowing that the Walking Dead are too brainless to realize that they literally hold the keys to my demise. Day 3. I did it. I'm not proud of it, but the overwhelming thirst drove me to it. Unfortunately, there's not much left in the bowl. I flushed to see if the water level would rise again, but it didn't. I've kept the bowl clear of contamination, though. I have taken some small measure of revenge against my future killers by relieving myself in their open mouths. I've become a fairly accurate shot, too. I stand just out of reach and then fire away. They do draw back from it, but I don't really know why. I'm sure it doesn't even register in their dead brains. It's still strange, though. The ones that I hit don't return. Day 4. I can't stand the relentless, overwhelming, crushing thought that I'm powerless, that at some point I'll succumb. I'm gonna try to grab the keys. I don't know what I'll do from there, but it's clear that help isn't coming. If I want to survive, I'll have to do it on my own. Day 5. This will be my last entry. I can't believe what a fool I was. Even though I was able to grab the keys, I paid for it dearly. 2 of them got a hold of my arm and bit right through it. I wrenched away with all my strength, screaming in sheer agony as my injured arm ripped away from my body, leaving them with a snack and me with a bloody stump. I'm bleeding as I write this. I haven't even tried to stop it. I'd rather die this way than be ripped to pieces by those creatures. At least it's on my terms, not theirs. If someone finds this, I hope that something in these pages will be of some help. I only wish it could be more. Maybe by keeping these creatures distracted here, someone else is having a fighting chance to escape. I hope so. Goodbye. I destroyed the notebook. Standard procedure. Contain the threat, contain the information. That's what we do. It was a big deal locally, but we were able to keep it out of the national news. We told the public there was a toxic gas leak that made people sick, but that it was being contained. The explosion at the gas station was covered as a random accident. It did help us with cleanup, though. Nothing like a giant fire to throw all the undead bodies on. I salute the unfortunate soul for his brave sacrifice. I just wish we'd been called in sooner. We might have been able to save him. The leaves crunched as I walked along the vast, beautiful forest. The blinding sun shone ever so brightly in the sky, setting ever so slowly over the horizon. A breezy wind blew through the forest, singing a quiet song in my ears as I continued to walk. I could hear the sound of animals scurrying through the forest, giving life to the terrain that Mother Nature ever so graciously built. As I navigated my way through the forest, I looked around at all the shady trees as I jumped over all the logs that lay on the ground. I imagined the life each tree had had, how many people throughout history had walked the same path I was. Each tree was a story to be told, each as old as nature itself. I was a big thinker as a kid, always asking my parents questions about how the world worked. I was always in my head, wandering around the worlds that I created. Worlds of cities built with bright diamonds, fantasy lands where I was the hero of my own tale. Nature was my escape from everything. I would imagine myself fighting the ferocious beasts that I had created in my head, or that I was on an adventure to Mordor with Frodo. This time, I imagined I was walking on the Death Trail in search of an ancient treasure buried by Blackbeard himself. I fought devilish beasts whose teeth could destroy a whole tree with a single bite, a dragon whose eyes shined with crimson and breathed fire as hot as the sun. The forest was my favorite place to think, for this inviting evergreen forest was beautiful in every way. The sound of squirrels chattering could be heard as the birds sang their final song, for the sun was setting slowly on the horizon. Bright, vibrant colors filled the sky. The forest sparkled as sunlight crackled across the trees, lighting up the dirt path ahead of me, decorated with roots and flowers of many kinds. It was lively. The sound of scurrying could be heard on every side. The leaves and twigs crunched under my feet, and the branches hung as if they were welcoming me. I breathed gracefully, my body feeling a slight chill as I walked through the path. I was deep inside my imagination when the sound of water took me out of my thoughts. I always hated that sound. It meant that soon I'd have to turn back. I continued my way, trying to ignore the sound, but it was becoming increasingly harder as I reached the river. I slowed my pace, trying to prolong my journey back home. It wasn't long, though, until I saw the sparkling blue river, the sound of crashing water filling my ears as I reached my endpoint. I stopped and cleaned off my arms and hands from the dirt that always found its way onto my body. I felt the water flow through my hands as I looked through the water in the tree line. I would always turn back at the river, for my fear of drowning kept me at bay. I would sometimes walk along that river, dipping my hands into the water as I walked. Something in me didn't feel fear of the water that day, though. I felt adventurous. I contemplated as I looked beyond the river stream. There was a whole other part of the forest beyond it, new lands to be discovered. I looked up at the sky. The sun was almost over the horizon. I thought about being out here at night, thoughts of monsters and creatures capturing me. I remembered my stories, though, the hero who saved the world from danger. Suddenly, without a second thought, it was like my body just got up and began to jump on the rocks in the river. I felt the water on my feet as I stopped on each of the rocks before jumping to the next. Once I reached the other side, I quickly ran into the forest beyond. I walked along as I studied the trees to get a good idea of my surroundings to find my way back. I made landmarks on trees out of chalk and always carry some with me so I wouldn't get lost, something I always do when traveling new terrain. Something about this area felt off, though. It was as if Mother Nature had left, leaving her creations in ruin. It was a lot darker than I thought it would be. There were so many trees that it blocked out the sun. I was a fearless kid, though. I thought that I couldn't be harmed, for nature was my dearest friend. I was wrong, though, for no one is safe from the brutality of Mother Nature, not even me. As I walked through the forest, I looked ahead to get a good map of the terrain in my head. Shadows gathered around the forest as the dark trees hung over me like limbs from an ancient world. There was an ominous silence that filled the woods. No sounds of animals running around, no crickets or frogs chirping, no wind twirling in my ears, just pure and utter silence. The only thing I could hear was the sound of leaves crunching underfoot as I walked. I noticed a tree that looked like a hideous witch, its gnarled limbs and black claws stretching over me, almost serving as a warning not to go any further. This was a tree that had died many years ago from the look of it, succumbing to nature's life cycle. I stared at it for a few minutes, feeling an uneasiness that crawled at the back of my throat. I continued my journey across the uncharted forest, but the tree stayed embedded in my mind. There was a feeling of dread that I fought off as my heart felt uneasy. The forest seemed dead, as if it was abandoned long ago. Stumps were scattered across the forest grounds. The clumps of bushes lay among the stumps. Twigs snapped from my feet. The brown trees were so close to each other, forming a thick canopy. It was barely bright enough for me to see ahead, yet I did not stop. There was a mixture of feelings that I felt I couldn't describe. One thing was for sure, though. It felt as if I was being watched. It was like the trees had eyes of their own and were watching me very closely. My senses widened, my skin tingling. I breathed deeply and listened with great intensity. My instincts were telling me that something was off, a deep feeling that crept over me like a beast. I kept looking behind me to make sure nothing was following me, scanning my surroundings with great efficiency. That's when something caught my eye. Straight ahead, deep in the forest, barely in eyesight, stood a tall, dark figure that peered at me from behind a tree. I was paralyzed in shock, gripped by the sudden strong urge of fear that froze my entire body as I stared at whatever was ahead of me. I couldn't make out any features. It was so dark that I couldn't see the mysterious figure clearly. It felt as though our eyes were locked together, but I couldn't even see its eyes. It felt like it was staring right through my soul. I tried to convince myself it was all in my mind, but everything in me told me otherwise. It just stood there, staring at me. My body couldn't move. I tried to, but my brain had just shut off. As I looked at this creature, everything about it just didn't seem right. Its arms were so long that one of them touched the ground. The other wrapped around the tree. Its head had a weird shape to it, as if it was stretched out. The creature stood incredibly tall. It had to be at least 9 feet. It was skinny, as if it was just pure bones and nothing else. It didn't feel like an animal. It felt like two intelligent beings staring at each other. Somehow it felt even quieter than it had before, silence creeping down my whole body, paralyzing me. Everyone has a fight-or-flight reflex, but in some instances, when a human reaches a new level of fear they've never felt before, they just freeze. You try to move, but it's like you're being gripped by an invisible force, every instinct in you telling you to run, but you just can't. Even though I've fought every monster and beast in my head, when faced with real danger, I didn't fight. All I could feel was fear. Fear of the unknown, the certainty of death. A cold chill filled the air. Even with no wind, it got colder. My body violently shook, legs trembling with pure dread and fear. I felt the thing looking me up and down, as if it were studying me. Neither of us made a single move, as if it too was paralyzed. Sweat dripped down my face. I breathed heavily as a panic attack began to emerge out of the darkening pit of my hell, dragging me down as it threatened to devour me. Suddenly, the creature quickly disappeared behind the tree. The sudden movement caused my brain to snap out of its paralysis, and my legs started moving. It was like my primal instinct kicked in, instincts given to us from our primal ancestors. My mind was racing with thoughts as I wondered what it was I had just seen. I was trying to convince myself that it was just an animal, but everything in me told me that something was not right. I could hear my own heartbeat as it tried to claw its way up my chest. Keep going straight. Soon you should see a large tree that has vines wrapped around it. Once you reach that, turn right, and you should see a tree with white chalk. Keep running towards that until you see the stump that you almost fell over. Make another right and keep going forward, I thought to myself, mapping out the forest in my head. My skills of navigation have never helped me before like this, and I was running and thinking at such a speed that I was hurting both my head and my legs. I started to smell a foul stench, something that smelled like a rotten corpse. It filled the forest, and I nearly gagged once it poured into my nose. A clicking noise surrounded me, fast and animalistic. I started to hear something in the forest running behind me, footsteps sounding heavy and fast. I looked back for a second to see if I could see whatever was chasing me, but all I could see was the dark open forest. I looked back and continued my way towards the river. I weaved my way through the forest quickly, making sharp lefts and rights and turning my way back to safety. My legs felt like they were going to break. My heart was hammering at my chest as my lungs were set ablaze. I listened to the sound of running behind me. The clicking was even closer and louder than before. The smell even stronger and fouler. It, too, knew how to navigate the forest as I did, maybe even better. My skin felt cold as I shook to the point where I almost fell many times, but I always caught myself just in time. Make a sharp right turn once you reach the dead tree. Once you see the rock that stands tall, make a left and keep running straight. It was like my mind was on adrenaline too, thinking at such a pace that I never thought I could before. The running behind me sounded even closer, the stench even stronger. My legs felt as if they were going to break, yet my speed still stayed the same as I used every ounce of energy I had. A familiar sound filled my ears, a sound I've always hated and despised. It was the river. It was close. I ignored the pain I felt in my legs and continued to run as whatever was behind me was catching up. My heart was beating like a war drum. I was running off of pure adrenaline at this point. My chest felt as if someone was squeezing my internal organs together, my feet burning from the many blisters I had. I ignored it all, though, and continued to guide myself through the cruelty of Mother Nature. I began to see the river stream. I was approaching it rapidly. My legs felt numb, my lungs on fire as I breathed heavily out of the exhaustion of fear. It sounded like it was only a few feet behind me. I knew that if I didn't reach the river, then it would catch me soon. The clicking sound was basically right in my ear. The stench was so strong that I gagged. I used every ounce of energy I had to run even quicker, ignoring all the pain I felt in my body. I hurtled out of the forest once I reached the river and jumped my way across the rocks that stuck out, falling onto my knees once I reached the other side. I quickly got back up and began to run again. I didn't stop running until my body collapsed, not being able to move. I hadn't noticed that it had turned to night, a dark umbra surrounding the forest. I was too exhausted to move. Every breath struck my chest deep. Yet there was no sign of anything chasing me or this foul smell that had followed me. The sound of wind and nature filled my ears again, replacing the terrifying clicking noises. Tears began to slowly drip down my face, mixing with my sweat. I opened my mouth to let out a whimper that never came, too exhausted to even make a sound. I wanted to go home, back to where my mother was. I started to breathe even heavier, my heart beating so fast that it was like having a heart attack. Everything became fuzzy and blurry, my mind racing with thoughts that only made me panic worse. I shook rapidly. I felt gripped by a sudden force that squeezed my body tight. My chest pounded in pain. It felt as if everything was being smashed by a hammer. I felt an impending doom dragging me down into deep darkness, deeper than any pit of despair I'd ever known. I tried to catch my breath, but it was just too much for me. I thought that whatever chased me would find me and devour my very soul. Everything was so loud, it felt like I was trapped in a tornado. I felt like I was going to throw up from the dizziness. My muscles were tense. The world was spinning around me as my heart started to pound worse than it ever had before. The pain from my chest slowly spread to my shoulders, giving a sharp pain in both of them. I got chills all over my body, gripped in fear and anxiety that had its hold on me and wouldn't let go. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was going to die a gruesome and horrifying death. I looked at the night sky as if it was in the hands of death and noticed how beautiful it looked. The pale crescent moon shone like a silver claw in the night sky. I looked upon the vast sea of stars, shining so brightly like little diamonds in the sky. Everything slowly went quiet. It was like the earth stopped. I felt the summer green grass on my hands and looked at the trees that surrounded me. Fireflies filled the darkness, sparkling like precious valuable stars in that dark place. The sound of crickets could be heard all around, chirping their song in replacement of the birds singing. My heart slowly started beating in a steady rhythm, and my breath slowed to a smooth pace. I breathed in a smell that was a woodsy fragrance, letting go of all my worries. It was as if Mother Nature cradled me in her arms, reassuring me that everything was all right. I felt a moment of tranquility, my mind silenced. I lay on the earth, admiring the beauty of the world around me. I slowly stood up, ignoring the pain I felt in my legs and chest. I welcomed back the blossoming, fragrant forest as I walked slowly through Mother Nature's creation. I began to walk home, admiring every inch of it that surrounded me. I always imagined the beautiful land in my head, landscapes of fantasy filled with bright colors. I never realized that I was already in a dazzling world, filled with so many mysteries to be discovered. The forest was breathtaking tonight, sparkling in the moonlight like little crystals. I wasn't in my head on the walk home. My mind was silent for a change. Brown trees stood tall. The flowers bloomed, engulfing the forest in a smell so lush and fresh. I thanked Mother Nature that night, for she taught me a lesson that I'll never forget. I'm not invincible. I'm no hero or great warrior. I'm just a child. Not every story needs a hero, and I don't have to be the hero in every story. I walked my way home, embracing the forest for the first time. Have you ever met a serial killer? I think I did, and I'm relieved that I didn't know it at the time. I used to chat a lot on MSN Messenger when I was in college. I was a shy and kind of nerdy girl, so talking and flirting with random guys was much easier when it was online instead of in the real world. We used to have a lot of internet stores that you could go and pay a couple of bucks and use the computer a couple times a week. I mean, it was the early 2000s, and technology wasn't available to everyone just yet. Sometimes it was just writing, and sometimes we'd use the cameras. There was this one guy that I remember really well. He was a lawyer, or so he said. He always refused to use the camera, even after we'd known each other for about a year. He was witty and funny, and I really liked him. He was a little bit older than me. He was pretty good at sex talk, which was somehow appealing to a girl in her late teens. He was always asking personal questions. Where do you live? Do you live alone? Do you live with your family? Do you have a boyfriend? Can you travel alone? Of course, I always diluted the conversation and never gave him any information. Sometimes I would tell him a fake story, but then he would ask details, and I would end up telling him that it was fake and laughing about it. You would think it would bother him, but it didn't. He would always laugh and say it was just my wild imagination. I think our virtual relationship lasted for about 3 years. Now that I'm thinking about it, it lasted until I graduated college. One time he came to town where I was living. I was in my senior year. He said it was for work and insisted that we meet up. I agreed and told him about a coffee place where I like to drink coffee. He declined and said he had to work all day and that he'd be available after 9 p.m. and proposed that we meet in the apartment where he was staying. I thought it was weird, but at the same time I was excited and eager to meet him in real life. I finally agreed and told myself I'll just pass by and say hello and that'll be that. We agreed to meet the following day. He sent me the address, and because I know the area, I knew I would find my way easily. Unfortunately, that day at university, we had to prepare for a conference, me and a group of friends. The meeting took us longer than I'd planned, so I sent a message to the guy telling him that I had an unexpected bit of work to finish and I couldn't make it. He never responded, and I never heard from him again. A few years passed, and I moved to another city where I was pursuing a PhD. One day, out of nowhere, I received a mail from this guy. It was just a regular mail, where he was asking how I was doing and what I'd been up to lately. Honestly, I was a little bit surprised. We exchanged a few emails after that, and he told me he'd be happy to meet up if I was able to make time for him. That made me laugh. I thought, well, maybe it's time to finally meet this guy. Where I was living happened to be an hour away from the city he was living in. After a few back and forths and some more emails, he gave me the address. The location struck me as odd, but I didn't really think about it at the time. It was a bit out of the way, in a city I had visited a few times before. It was a new neighborhood. I didn't even think people were living there yet. The way I was supposed to get to his house was a bit weird, too. He said he would guide me on the phone and tell me how to get to his place. I took the train anyway, arriving at the station, and took a cab as I headed towards his neighborhood. I had to stop at an intersection and follow his instructions on the phone as he said. When the cab arrived at the intersection, the driver asked me if I was sure where I was going. I lied and told him this was the right area. I was surrounded by suburb villas, the kind with high walls and well-maintained front trees. It was a bit unnerving as I walked on the street where he said he lived. It was quiet. Too quiet. At the end of the street, there was a dozen duplexes with well-maintained hedges instead of fences. The street was empty but for 2 cars that passed by before I took a turn into an alleyway. I called him and he took me from there. I followed his instructions until I stopped in front of a duplex with a garage and a well-maintained front lawn. There was no car outside, and all the windows seemed to be closed but on the upper floors. The space in front of the garage was unexpectedly clean, and for a moment I thought maybe I had missed the right house. That's when I heard him say on the phone, "I can see you. Come on ahead inside." Then I looked up and saw the curtain dropping. I felt a real sense of unease, but I ignored it. "Come on, don't be silly. I know this guy for almost 6 years. I'll finally get to meet him in person," I said to myself. I stepped towards the front door, pushed it when I came inside. It was the entrance to the duplex, leading up to a small lobby with stairs. The lobby was completely quiet, as if no one else lived here. I was about to close the door when, for some reason, I decided not to close it and just push it quietly. I went upstairs and saw number 11 on the door on the right. Before I could tap on the woody door, he opened it wildly. The inside of the apartment was kind of dark because of the lack of natural light. He stood there, wearing a black shirt and gray pants and bare feet, which was odd. He was partially bald and neatly shaved. He smiled and stuck his hand out for me to shake. "Well, hello there. You finally decided to do it, huh?" Something in his features was unsettling, as if he was up to something. It was as if I could see in his cold gray eyes something I couldn't explain that made me feel in danger. I reached out my hand to greet him. The moment his hand touched mine, a chill ran down my spine. "Yeah, finally," I responded out of politeness. My uneasiness must have shown on my face. He shook my hand, but he didn't let go of it, and his grip tightened. "I don't like it. I don't like this at all." "You can let go of my hand now," I said, with false amusement. He grinned, but he didn't let go. At that instant, I went into fight-or-flight mode. My heart started racing, and all my senses went crazy. He grabbed my hand and tried to pull me inside. I threw politeness out the window and yelled, "Let go of me! I said let go!" I was standing on the threshold. I gripped the wall with my left hand and tried to pull away from him. When I looked up, I saw the creepy expression of a predator and a smile that said, "I finally got you." I was not only trapped, but I also knew that no one would hear me outside the duplex. Even if someone could hear me, they'd have no idea where the screams were coming from. He wasn't a big guy. He was around my height and maybe a little overweight. Otherwise, he was able to easily overwhelm me. So I took my chance and let go of the wall and stepped inside. It caught him off guard, and I grabbed the doorknob with my left hand and began to slam the door repeatedly on his arm as he tried to walk me inside. He finally let go of my hand, and I heard a grunt as he fell over inside. I thanked God for my decision to leave the front door open. I ran through the quiet alleyway without looking back until I reached the intersection. I looked behind me, but I saw no one, so I continued running. I couldn't find any cabs in the area, so I ran nearly 10 minutes before spotting a cab. While running after him, I yelled the taxi down and waved my hands. He must have seen me in his rearview mirror because he came to a complete stop. I dashed to the cab, shaking uncontrollably as I got inside. The driver gave me a wide look and was about to ask me a question when I blurted out, "To the train station. Please, hurry." He gave me a brief look before resuming the drive. I arrived at the station, purchased the ticket, and then boarded the first train to my hometown. I switched off my phone because I was afraid that he would call or message me. When I arrived, I went to the train station convenience store and pretended to look for something. I knew they'd have cameras there, so if he followed me, I'll be caught on camera. I spent nearly 10 minutes wandering between the aisles. Finally, I went up to the cashier and bought a bottle of water. On my way home, I took 2 cabs in opposite directions to confuse anyone that was following me. I didn't feel safe until I got home and shut the door. For a brief moment, I considered calling the police, but what would I say to them? He didn't do anything. I hadn't been harmed, and I'm an adult who understands what I was doing. I cursed my stupid lack of self-preservation. I told no one about this misadventure and vowed never to go through another dangerous situation like this again. I never heard from the guy after that, but it took several months for me to completely forget about the encounter and move on with my life. Until this morning, that is, when I was reading the newspaper and noticed a familiar face, a face I'd never forget. The photo was titled MSN Predator. the serial killer who lured his victims to his home and never let them leave. According to the article, all 24 victims were young women between the ages of 17 and 23, whom the killer met on Messenger. During the interrogation, the defendant stated that some of his victims had been chatting with him for more than 2 years, and only one girl had slipped between his fingers twice, as he put it, because she was somehow smarter than the others. Since people seem to enjoy my last creepy tale from Appalachia, I'll start writing the rest down, while I've still got some breath in my lungs. When we were kids, my older brother and I used to play army out in the woods, deep in the hollers and on the ridge tops of the South Appalachians, in western North Carolina. We built all kinds of foxholes and forts and walls and trails and everything in between. You name it, our imagination could frame it out and build it up. We never felt uncomfortable, never felt watched, or even kind of uneasy. Until one late fall weekend where the leaves were starting to let go, but still crunched beneath your feet just before the snow came down. We had marched a mile or so back through the old logging trails, grown up so thick you could scarcely get a grown man through in some spots. We found a perfect spot to start the next fort. It was flat, no trees, about 50 feet, both long and wide. Plenty of leaves covering it meant a good raking of them up into piles at the clearing's edge would make for impenetrable walls for our imaginary attackers. We set to work with only our feet in our hands, as we hadn't grabbed our father's tools that day to clear the leaves from the clearing. We set about piling them up as best we could along the edges. We decided we needed a foxhole to hide in, directly in the center of the clearing. As we redistributed more and more of the leaves, we discovered 9 large and oddly shaped rocks that formed a neat circle in the center of the clearing. We didn't pay much attention to the discovery at the time, and diligently worked at our task at hand. It started to get late, and we could hear our mother whistling loudly through the autumn forest for us to come home. We relented and decided to grab a rake, mattock, and a shovel the next time we were out, so as to build our impregnable fortress the best as possible. As we walked home, the forest came alive with all manner of nocturnal critters. Coyotes yipped and barked, bobwhites cooed, owls screeched and hooted. It was relaxing, and the air was warm, but only just in our faces. My brother and I laid our plans out for the next day to build our ultimate fortress. We went so far as to draw up a rudimentary blueprint, complete with the large rocks that occupied the newly found fortress site. As we looked closer at the blueprints, we realized that the rocks had formed a circle. Perfect. We would be able to fence it in and build the foxhole right in the center. We ate our dinner, not speaking a word of our plan to our parents, and took an early leave for bed. We awoke early in the morning, before our parents, and went to grab all of Dad's tools we would need for the day. The air was so much cooler this morning than the last, and slightly breezy, with an overcast sky keeping the warmth of the sun out. We donned our coats and hunting orange beanies so as to be safe in the woods during hunting season, per our parents' instructions, and set off. As we walked, my brother and I noted the eerie silence, but chalked it up to the cool and windy weather. The only wildlife we observed were a few ravens that seemed to observe us as we walked, never flying away as we approached, but rather watching us from the tall trees. As we trekked our way back the mile or so into the wilderness, we talked excitedly about the fort we were going to build. We alluded as to how our older cousins would be jealous when they came to check it out. As we came upon the site, I noticed an eerie feeling of unease, like we were trespassing, and someone or something didn't want us to be there. I thought nothing of it as we set about raking the leaves into a wall. After an hour or so, all the leaves had been raked out of the clearing and into the edges, forming a neatly stacked little border wall. All the while, my uneasy feeling of some sort of transgression never really ended. My brother took notice and asked me teasingly, "What's wrong with you? You afraid of the woods, you little girl?" And I laughed, but I replied, "It feels weird out here, like we're not supposed to be here." He called out some names and told me that he would protect me from anything out in the woods that came to get me, in true older brother fashion. This didn't put my uneasiness at rest, but I lied and told him that he'd made me feel a little better by saying it. The time had come to start our foxhole in the center of the clearing within the rock circle. We started with the mattock, breaking up the ground and pulverizing the tiny rocks as we broke through the long, undisturbed surface of red clay that is so common throughout the southern Appalachians. The deeper we gouged into the earth, the worse my feeling of uneasiness grew, until it was pure dread. I had been shoveling out the dirt as my brother broke it up, and I stopped. He sank the mattock into the earth a few more times, and as he looked at me, seeming to ask why I had stopped, he brought the tool down one more time with a resounding clunk. He had struck something. Before either of us could exchange questions, I forgot my feeling of dread and began shoveling again, feverishly this time, to see what we had hit. Maybe it was treasure. Maybe it was a meteorite or something cool. As I brought the dirt out of the hole and onto the surface, it became clear what we had struck. Stained red by decades of subterranean existence in the ferocious clay was a human skull with a large chunk taken out by the mattock. We stepped back in absolute horror, all excitement and happiness drained from our demeanor. I, being 8 years old, screamed and began to cry. It felt like we had killed this person ourselves. It felt like we had stashed the bodies here and prayed not to get caught. My stomach churned and I vomited my breakfast onto the clearing floor. As we reeled from the revelation, the very atmosphere around us seemed to grow cold and unfriendly, like we had disturbed something unnatural. We stood in the silence for what seemed like eternity as the wind shifted the tree branches around us. I heard what I thought was our mother whistling for us to come home. My brother heard it as well, and we both lit out for the house, not wanting to spend any more time in the presence of whatever we had exhumed. As we walked back through the woods at a much quicker pace than we had entered, the claustrophobic trail seemed to get even more tight in places. At times, they almost seemed unfamiliar. It was like the forest itself was trying to keep us from getting back to the safety of our home. We finally burst through the trailhead, tools in hand, just as a bolt of lightning split the sky, arcing down in all directions like nature itself had become infuriated by our actions. We walked inside after putting the tools away, just as the downpour started. I called for our mother throughout the house, but there was no answer. We walked around towards the carport and saw that Dad's car was gone. Though it was before the golden age of cell phones, my father was provided a company phone that he always kept on him, so we picked up the landline and dialed him. Mom picked up the phone, much to our relief. They had stepped out to get pizza and a movie from Flick Video because they didn't want to cook tonight. For a brief few hours, we forgot about the terror of the day. For the most part, there was still a gnawing, biting feeling in my stomach as we sat and watched the movie Mom and Dad had rented. As it grew nearer to bedtime, the feeling of dread returned, growing stronger all the time. I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned for hours until I eventually found a comfortable enough position to drift off. I began to dream that I was once again on the trail to the clearing, only this time the sun was not out, but the orangish yellow glow of the harvest moon lit the entire path like a giant lantern in the sky. There were no stars, only the moonlight emanating from the blackness of the night sky. As I walked, my feet made no sound, even when stepping on dried out twigs or leaves. This had to be a dream, yet it felt so real and lucid. I walked almost as if my body was controlled by someone else down the path to the clearing. As I drew nearer and nearer to the site where we had unearthed that strange and unmarked grave, I began to notice a pale glow coming from the clearing. Upon approaching the area, I noticed something that I won't soon forget, though it's been 20 years since I've seen it. The origin of that pale glow was a hunched-over, wrinkled, gaunt woman. Her jet-black hair hung in very thin wisps off her head. Her lips seemed to have dried up and decayed off her thin and leathery face a long time ago. She was stark naked, covered in a fox fur, the glowing fungi that is found throughout Appalachia. She was sobbing and mourning softly as I kept my distance and observed her. I inched closer to see if I could figure out what she was hunched over, and when I did, a twig snapped underfoot. Time stood still. My heart raced and my skin began to sweat in the split second that it took for the sound wave to reach that ghastly-looking woman. Her gaze immediately snapped in my direction with an unnatural speed, and at all the wrong moments for any human on this plane of existence. Her piercing eyes were further apart than a human being's should be, and devoid of pupils. Her nose was bulbous and hung off her face like a diseased zucchini squash. Whatever the hell this was, it was no longer a person, if ever it had been. Her eyes immediately locked with mine, and I knew I was caught. She screamed an evil shriek, shrill and terrible. I immediately wheeled around and began to run, but to no avail. I only gained about 4 steps before I felt a grab and a mighty pull on my ankle. I was mid-step, my leg in mid-air, and I met the earth with a hard smack. When I regained consciousness a few minutes later, I was being dragged across the forest floor towards the clearing by this woman-like monstrosity that stood a full head and shoulders above any man. I was too dazed and confused to scream, and I could only watch in horror as this thing dragged me across the forest floor towards the center of the stone circle. Perched upon the 9 stones were the very ravens which my brother and I had seen in the daylight, their beady eyes focused on mine, cawing and cackling as I was thrown into the circle of stones. I looked up into the face of the thing that had dragged me to where I lay, and as I did so, she burst forth with the most shrill and evil cackling I had ever heard. It filled the airways and resonated within the very earth upon which I lay. Her gnarled and cavity-riddled teeth jutted haphazardly from her overly large mouth at different angles of varying degrees of sharpness. Her black, diseased tongue licked what remained of her putrid lips as she cast her gaze downward at my helpless body. The ravens began to caw in rhythm as she reached out towards me with long fingers that terminated in sharp, dagger-like nails that were more akin to claws than fingernails. The cawing quickened as she made contact with my chest. I felt the nails sink into my skin as I screamed out in pain, still unable to move. The cawing grew louder and faster, drowning out my screams, just as she began to grip my chest to rip through into my body. A light split the sky then, so bright that, for a moment, all I could see was the white. The woman screeched a blood-curdling shriek. Then, the light was suddenly gone. When my vision returned, the woman was gone. The ravens were gone. The graves were covered over, and there stood my brother, in the midst of a frigid downpour, with shovel in hand. Not a word was exchanged, but we both knew what we had just witnessed. He pulled me up from the ground, and we headed for the trail towards the house. The rain slacked and stopped as soon as we were out of sight of the clearing, and the stars finally came out. The moon was just coming up. Its pale, soft white glow lit our hike back through the hills and hollers. We walked into the basement instead of the main entrance, so as not to wake up our parents. We shed our rain-soaked clothes, and as I took my shirt off, I noticed 5 deep punctures that had scabbed over. My brother dressed the wound as we both exchanged glances, and I slept in his bed that night, even though we were past the age of this being acceptable. We never told our parents of the event. We never spoke of it again. I did some research years later and discovered the story of an older woman who'd been accused of 9 counts of witchery in the 1700s in the fort where my hometown lies. As such, she was burned in the square where the old fort was located. To this day, on autumn nights, from the safety of our parents' back porch, you can still hear an old woman cackling on cool autumn breezes and the screams of a dying young child led astray by the most evil thing I'd ever encountered. I grew up in southern Appalachia, in western North Carolina, 30 minutes outside the town of Asheville. The hills and hollers of the Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest mountains in the world, with some of the rock formations dating back over 1 billion years. That quite literally means they were here before there were terrestrial animals. As with most things that have been on Earth for a long time, there are inexplicable anomalies, both benevolent and malevolent. For example, the Brown Mountain Lights. Never in my life have I felt threatened or uneasy when witnessing them from Wiseman's view. They're neither good nor evil, they just are. On the benevolent side, sometimes you can walk through an abandoned old church, up near my mom and dad's property, and you can feel a good, warm, happy energy. It's like that first warm day of summer when the sunshine is not too hot, but not too cold either. Well, this story is not about one such anomaly. It's about something that's definitely malevolent. About a decade ago, I was in night school at the AB Tech, going to school for automotive mechanics. I would go into class about 2 p.m. after I got off my part-time job, and I would end up getting home about 10:30, depending on the traffic, that is. Every night I drove the same road in my old 1973 W200 Dodge pickup. Some nights it would get rather boring, and I would take a different route, jump off of I-40 and drive the back roads. On this particular evening, I had decided to just stay on the I-40 because I just wanted to get home and go to bed. It was Thursday, and there was no class on Friday. I wanted to get in bed early so I could go up in the woods and go hiking early tomorrow morning and watch the sun come up. As I jumped off the I-40 onto the exit where my parents lived, the night seemed to get darker, and none of the animals that I could hear through my rolled-down windows made any more noise. The cab of my truck became smaller and smaller, and my breath quickened. I've never faced any kind of anxiety in my life, but at that moment, something felt off, and there was no way I could put my finger on what it was. I came to a stop on the exit ramp, turned to go down the road, and happened to notice that the gas station off the exit where Mom and Dad lived had no lights on. They were a 24-hour truck stop, and always had lights on, but I didn't think about it again after noticing. I just chalked it up to a power outage, but I could not shake the feeling that something was definitely askew. I slowly shifted through all the old truck gears, not wanting to make any more noise than an old pickup truck already did. I leaned over my steering wheel to look up at the moon through the windshield, and there was barely any stars visible, which was way out of the ordinary. If you've ever been to Appalachia, primarily the sparsely populated areas where I'm from, you can see the Milky Way on a clear night. An absence of stars back home is only due to cloud cover, or whatever in the hell went on this particular night. As I rounded a particularly sharp left-hand curve and chugged through a straight stretch before the next right-hander, I looked at the ancient, decaying barn I always gazed at when riding that stretch of road, and thought about how long that thing had been here, and how many advancements and civilizations it had seen. For the split second that my gaze wandered, a very large, sickly-looking dog ran out in front of my truck, no more than 10 feet in front of me. Old Betsy was a good truck, but she didn't stop well. Thump, thump! I heard the fence post I had left in my truck bounce up in the bed, and then back into it as I slid to a stop. My first thought was, oh God, now I have to go tell these neighbors that I ran over their dog. That shit doesn't go real far with people around here. It can really kinda set them off, depending on the dog and the person. As I sat there breathing in the smell of burning rubber, something else found its way into my nose. The stench of rotting flesh. It's not a smell you ever forget once you smell it one time. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. I just chalked it up to some rotting roadkill nearby. Finally, I thought to myself, let me check and see who this dog belongs to. I pushed my clutch in, shifted to reverse, and as I looked in my rearview mirror, illuminated by the haunting glow of my reverse lamps, was the same dog, only it wasn't on 4 legs anymore. It stood up, like a man over 10 feet tall. Only then did it dawn on me that the front of my truck was every bit of 5 feet tall, and this dog was every bit of 5 feet tall at the shoulders on all fours. As it turned its head to look in the direction of my truck, I caught only a glimpse of this creature. It was not a dog. It certainly was not a man. It was somewhere in between, and at the same time, entirely separate altogether. Its skin hung loose off its emaciated frame, like a raccoon. Bits of matted fur and dirt and mud clung to its legs like a disease. The right arm seemed a little bit longer than the left, and they both hung abnormally low in relation to either animal this creature seemed to be. As it regained its senses, it turned and looked into the mirror like it knew exactly where I was sitting. The face was that of a man, but the very edges of its face seemed not to be totally defined. They seemed to move and change, like something you could see at a cellular level in a scientific documentary. There were no eyes, but only sockets where eyes should be. No hair either, and the skin that was dripping off its face was a cold, lifeless gray color. The nose was short and shoved into its face like a bulldog, but the teeth still haunt me. It was definitely carnivorous, and true to form, the rest of its unnatural look, many of its teeth didn't seem to be arranged in a natural way in its mouth. They seemed to fill and spill forth from the undefinable face, almost like they knew the horror they occupied, and they were searching for a way out. It stared through my life, into my eyes and past my soul. It seemed like an eternity, but it could not have been more than 5 seconds that I sat there paralyzed. A light came on at the house next to the road, causing the creature to snap its gaze in that direction, tear off into the woods on its back 2 legs. I jammed my old truck into first gear and roasted tires all the way through first, snatched second, and drove as fast as I could home. When I got to the house, both my parents were asleep. I went downstairs into my bedroom and loaded every firearm I possessed and locked all the doors. I couldn't wake them up. Who would believe that? And at 10:30 on a Thursday night? The basement was eerily quiet that night. Even their dog that got up to raise hell outside if any animal came close was dead silent. The old post and beam house didn't even creak or pop that night, as was usual. At about 3 a.m., I finally started to get drowsy, and as I went to lay my head down and get some sleep so I could still attempt to go hiking the next morning, I smelled the stench of death again. It was faint at first, but it was definitely there. I thought to myself, you're just going crazy. None of that was real. But as I dwelt on it, it became more and more noticeable until it filled the entire basement. My dad has a home office in the basement with 2 large glass doors that face the Pisgah National Forest, an impenetrable 500,000-acre wood. I finally worked up the courage to walk out of my bedroom and into the basement's living area, with my little tactical 12-gauge loaded, tack light on. I covered the flashlight with my hand so as not to make my presence known until it needed to be, and as I turned right out of the living room into my dad's office, I shined the light through the glass doors, and at the edge of the woods, there stood the creature. It was motionless. It stared right into the light, unafraid, with those soulless sockets devoid of eyes. I quickly covered my tack light, ran into the living room, and flipped on the outside floodlights in my surprise. But it was no longer standing at the edge of the woods, but between the house and the edge of the woods, still motionless. I swung the door open and fired every round I had in its direction. I must have scored a couple of hits because it screeched an unearthly scream, like that of a woman being slaughtered as it took to the woods. The dog went crazy. Mom and Dad woke up asking what the hell I was doing. I told them that a bear had gotten into the trash and I was scaring it away. They didn't believe me, but I know they wouldn't believe the truth either. I didn't sleep that night, or any time until the following Sunday. Everything seemed to return to normal, and I didn't think about the creature again until I met my wife about 6 years ago. Her mother's house sits at the mouth of the holler, no more than 4 or 5 miles up the road from my mother and father's house. Up on the side of the holler, there's a kennel for her brother's hunting dogs. No longer in use, and hasn't been for years, but the fence is still there, and the concrete pads are still there. It's a thing of great use when you need to quarantine an animal. Her Great Pyrenees had gotten into a tussle with a raccoon, which of course he destroyed, but his rabies vaccine had lapsed, so we had to keep him quarantined for a time. It didn't bother him. He kind of liked solitude. This particular night, we were coming home from a movie date in the neighboring town. It was the last night of quarantine for him. So we walked up the trail, using our phone flashlights to get to the kennel, and there he sat, patiently waiting, tail wagging, happy to see us. We put him on a leash and started walking him back towards the house with us. As we were walking back through the darkness, I started to feel that same feeling I'd felt the night I hit the creature in my truck. I didn't say anything so as not to alarm my wife, but When the smell came wafting in on the breeze, she jokingly asked me, "My God, what did you eat? You stink." I half laughed, not being able to fully appreciate the joke for the horror that raged in my mind. She immediately caught on and asked what was wrong, to which I could only reply, "I'll tell you later." She grew up in the woods and around hunting and things of that nature her whole life, so she knew what I meant. She knew we were being watched by something. When we could see the lights of the house from the trail to the kennel, we heard it. There came barking from the kennel that sound just like the Great Pyrenees we had on a leash next to us. It was a perfect imitation. The Pyrenees, being a guardian dog, immediately sensed that something was wrong, and so he turned to face the danger, belting out a deep bark and growl in that direction. I don't know if you've ever had to drag a 150-pound dog, but it sucks, and it's no easy task. I'm 6 feet, 240 pounds, and it was all I could do to get him back in the house. The barking never ceased the entire time we were running for the house. In fact, it seemed to grow closer and closer, till it seemed it was coming from inside my own head. Her mother heard the commotion and flipped the floodlights on, and we made it to the fence of the yard as I caught a glimpse of something coming to a dead stop at the end where the lights reached, wheeling around and tearing off into the darkness. My wife looked at me and said, "You want to tell me what the hell that was?" To which I replied, "Yes, let's go inside." I told her the story, and she listened intently, hanging on to every word. Her family came from a long line of granny witches and other supernatural healers from Appalachia, so her older sister came over the next morning with some herbs and chants to bless the property and to ward off evil. I suggested we go up to the dog kennels and do them as well. When we got to the kennels, they were completely destroyed. The very concrete foundation was cracked, and the chain-link fence was torn off its post. The dog houses were destroyed, and the place reeked of the stench that followed that creature. My wife's older sister just went about her business like normal, blessed the place, burnt some herbs, and led us back to the property. When we got into the house, she wheeled about on us suddenly and instructed us very firmly to never go into the woods after dark, not until this thing left me alone. To make a long story short, my wife joined the military, and she ended up getting stationed in Delaware. Well, as someone who lived around fairly large mountains and endless wilderness their entire life, Delaware is pretty terrible. At least, that was my thought when we first moved into the middle of a 50,000 plus population city. Fortunately, though, it didn't take long to find a house in a sleepy little community further south. We purchased the house and moved in with haste. We were both very grateful and glad to be out of the city and into a rural setting again. The land in Delaware seems lifeless in comparison to Appalachia. The sparsely populated woods don't possess any energy that goes one way or t'other. The ground doesn't seem to be alive like it is in Appalachia. Having had no thoughts about the creature in a long time, I resumed my staying outside after dark and playing with our dogs in a rather large yard that bordered on a small patch of woods. Well, last night I went outside to play with the dogs, and as dark set in, I built a decent-sized fire in my fire pit and consumed some good old-fashioned Appalachian mountain cough syrup from a mason jar. And just as the fire was dying down, my American bulldog tore off towards the woods. He has a habit of running off to go on adventures, so my immediate instinct was to chase him down in the yard and tackle him so he couldn't get away. As I tackled his 110-pound ass to the ground and threw him in a fireman's carry over my shoulder, I heard him begin to bark, only the bark wasn't coming from him. The only sound coming from him was a deep, rumbling growl, a noise I've never heard him make before. It was a threatening noise. Something was definitely wrong, and as I ran with him on my shoulder back to the house, the stench of death again began to fill the air. The other two dogs must have caught the wind and what was happening, and met me at the back door, which I threw open, slammed shut, and locked as I again began to load firearms. How the hell could this thing have followed us 650 miles up here? As I flipped the floodlights on at the back side of the house, several of the bushes and small trees at the forest's edge were still shaking like something had just run through them. My dogs went crazy all night, barking and howling and attempting to get out of the windows. I didn't sleep a bit, and I don't think I will for a while. I know for sure I won't be in the woods after dark again. Not in life. Not until this thing is gone.